Hi friends, Rick Edwards here. Welcome back to another study. Today we're going to be looking at a core passage from 1 Samuel chapter 15. It's a fascinating chapter, continuing our study through the book of 1 Samuel, thinking about, at this point, King Saul, but moving toward his successor, King David. So just some quick background. So 1 Samuel is about the book as a whole, you could argue, is about God's plan to give Israel a king. He did, in fact, want them to have a king, but it's also about God's desire to give them a certain kind of king. So we've talked about this before, and we have another video that talks about this business of God giving Israel a king. But you need to understand that the whole book of 1 Samuel is designed to help us understand that God did, in fact, planned to give them a king, but he desired for them to have a certain kind of king, which leads us then to understand that in the book of 1 Samuel, the book as a whole is designed to contrast King Saul with his successor, King David. Two very different men, very different kings. And so this study, today's study, further helps us understand what God is trying to show us throughout the book, that the king he desired, the kind of king he desired for Israel, was much more like King David than King Saul. King Saul was, in fact, the kind of king that the people wanted, while King David was the kind of king that God wanted them to have. And we're going to get into that. That's partly what these lessons are about. Now, first of all, I want to address an issue that's likely to come up in your lesson. So in today's story, Samuel is given a message by God to tell Saul to go and wipe out the Amalekites. Now, there's a lot of history going all the way back really to Genesis chapter 15, all the way back there where God has a plan to deal with the pagan, evil people in the Canaan land. But it raises an interesting point or question in the minds of many people who say, how could God possibly instruct the Israelites to go and kill all of the Amalekites? Men, women, children, even the animals. So it raises an important question. Now we've created another video that goes more into depth on this very issue, the problem of the Amalekites. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I do want to point out just one or two things. First of all, understand that the Amalekites were a very evil people, and they help us understand that God is very intent, God is very determined to protect his plan and his people. And God will deal ruthlessly with anyone or any group or anything that threatens his plan or his people. And it was necessary for him to deal ruthlessly with the Amalekites because their evil ways, their sinful practices were in fact a threat to his plan, God's plan, and a threat to his people, the Israelites, even if they didn't fully understand why the Amalekites were a threat to them. So if it comes up, address it. I just wouldn't try to spend the whole time talking about what I would call the problem of the Amalekites. God needed to deal ruthlessly with the Amalekites in order to protect his plan, which was much bigger than even the Israelites, and to protect his people, which were going to be influenced negatively as they were already, and by other peoples within the Canaan land, people they failed to displace. God needed to protect them from the Amalekites, so he had to deal ruthlessly with them. Now, moving on into the text and thinking about some of what's happening in the story. You can read the story, and you should read it, 1 Samuel chapter 15. But I want you to notice at a couple of places in there how Saul justifies his actions and interestingly tries to hide his motives from Samuel. In fact, it's as though he's trying to hide his actions justify his actions, and hide his motives from God himself. And it helps us understand, excuse me, helps us understand that God sees the heart. But Saul, it's as though Saul didn't understand that God was able to see his motives. God was able to see his heart. And that's part of what's going on in all these stories, was that Saul did not understand. He was not a man after God's own heart. He was not a man who understood that God even sees his own heart. So he didn't live as a man whose heart was open toward God. He didn't even understand that God could really see his heart. So he's trying to hide his motives, cover up his actions, justify his actions. And that's part of the point of these stories, is that Saul simply didn't understand the issues of the heart. He tended to focus on behavior. Now, there's a beautiful passage, a familiar passage within this chapter, in the context of Saul justifying his actions, and then Samuel explaining to Saul this beautiful text where he says, look, God is far more interested in your obedience than he is your sacrifice. Because Saul was under the impression, well, if I just do the sacrifice, if I just make a good sacrifice, then everything's going to be okay. And Samuel makes it very clear to him that the problem isn't an issue of sacrifice, but it's a problem of obedience, which is a problem of the heart. So these beautiful verses in verses 22 and 23 underscore Saul's fundamental problem, which was a problem of the heart. Now, he thought, if I could just act right, do the right things, offer the right sacrifices, behave in a certain way, then everything's going to be good. And Samuel tries to help him understand that the problem isn't your behavior, even though there were problems with his behavior. The real problem is that his heart was not right before God, which takes us back to the whole problem of this contrast between Saul and David, is that Saul's heart was not right, was not tender, was not pure before God. Now, that's not to say that David's heart was entirely pure. He had his problems, he had his issues. But the entire Bible points to David as a man after God's own heart. His heart was much more tender toward God than Saul. So, let me point this out to you, and then we'll conclude. The problem that we see between David and Saul, the contrast between David and Saul, is really the same problem that we see when we get to the New Testament. Because there, first of all with Jesus, and then later with Paul, and really all of the New Testament writers, address this issue of the difference between our behavior and our heart. Jesus dealt with it, especially in the Sermon on the Mount. He talked about, you've heard it said, your behavior should be this, but I'm saying to you, it's more important to look into the heart. Paul, especially in places like the book of Galatians, Paul talks about the fact that we are not justified, we are not made right before God by our outward behavior, by our adherence to any law, to the Mosaic law. That's not what justifies us. That's not what saves us. Rather, it's the condition of our heart as we turn our lives over to Jesus. His grace comes in, begins to transform us within the heart. So, New Testament theology, New Testament justification before God is a condition of the heart. God's grace begins to change us. Jesus begins to change us from the inside out, starting with the heart. Ultimately, our behavior changes. Ultimately, our actions change. Ultimately, we do live as God wants us to live, but he starts with the heart. And these stories of Saul are designed to contrast with David, who understood that the issue is a heart issue, whereas Saul was more focused and concentrated on just trying to behave appropriately and do the right things, especially in chapter 13 and again in chapter 15, thinking that if I just offer the right sacrifice, that's going to take care of everything. But that's not the case. So, an interesting study. Be sure to read the text, read the material, but keep in mind this contrast between Saul and David. and think about this issue of the Amalekites. Again, we have another video that will help you understand that. So thank you for watching.